Evelyn Hartwell slammed the bolt of fabric back onto the shelf so hard the whole rack shuddered, and then she stood there, chest heaving, eyes burning, while three of the wealthiest women in Red Hollow laughed like she'd done something funny. She hadn't done anything funny. She'd done the math. 17 cents in her pocket, $2.30 to her name in fabric costs, and a room full of people watching her realize out loud in public that she couldn't afford to fix her own clothes. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stood there and took it. She didn't know someone in the doorway had already decided that was the last time. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Because what happens next will remind you that quiet people are sometimes the most dangerous ones in the room. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Evelyn's story travels. Now let's go back to that store. Let's go back to the moment everything in Red Hollow changed. The bolt hit the shelf at 7 minutes past 10 on a Tuesday morning in June, and the sound it made was sharp enough that old Mr. Calloway looked up from his ledger behind the counter. He saw Evelyn Hartwell standing at the fabric wall with her hand still on the bolt, her back straight, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the shelving that wasn't actually there. He saw Margaret Aldis and Cecily Pruitt and Dora Whitmore standing 6 feet away from her, not pretending anymore that they weren't talking about her. He saw the whole thing. He looked back down at his ledger. He was not a brave man. He had a store to run. He told himself these things were not connected. Evelyn did not move for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time in a room that had gone as quiet as that one had. Then she picked up a different bolt. Plain muslin, cheapest thing on the shelf, and she carried it to the counter without looking at anyone, and she set it down, and she said, "How much for 2 yards of this, Mr. Calloway?" Not a question. She already knew the answer. She was buying time. 40 cents a yard, Calloway said. So 80 cents for 2. Evelyn opened her coin purse. She had 17 cents. "I'll come back for it," she said. She closed the purse. I'll come back." She turned and walked to the door. "Bless her heart," Dora Whitmore said not quietly. The door swung shut. The little bell above the frame rang once bright and clean, like it didn't know what kind of room it was marking the exit from. Outside, Evelyn walked. She walked fast. Not running, she refused to run. Running meant they'd won something she wasn't prepared to give, and she turned into the gap between Calloway's and the feed store next door, and she pressed her back against the wall, and she put both hands flat on the rough wood behind her, and she breathed. In through the nose. Hold. Out through the mouth. She'd learned this from Thomas of all people. Thomas, who'd had the lung sickness and spent the last year of his life teaching himself to breathe around the pain. She'd watched him do it so many times, she'd memorized it without meaning to, and now she used it when she needed to not fall apart in an alley behind a dry goods store, because 3 women with nothing better to do had decided to take her apart in public for sport. She counted to 60. She always counted to 60. Counting gave her hands something to do. At 43, she heard the door of Calloway's open and swing shut again. She didn't move. At 58, she heard boots on the boardwalk. Slow, even, not approaching. At 60, she pushed herself off the wall. She straightened her dress. She smoothed her hair. She picked up the coin purse she'd been crushing in her left hand, and she put it back in her pocket. She walked out of the alley. She walked to her wagon at the edge of town. She climbed up, gathered the reins, and she started the drive home. She did not cry until she was far enough out of town that nobody could see her. Then she cried for about 90 seconds. Then she stopped. She had work to do. The Hartwell Ranch sat on 40 acres of land that had been good once and was doing its stubborn best to still be good now. Thomas had bought it in 1878 with money borrowed from Harold Pruitt's bank and the confidence of a man who believed that work was its own reward, which it was, Evelyn had decided since, but the reward it gave was not always money. The land was solid. The grass came back every spring. The well hadn't failed yet. She ran a small herd 22 cattle as of last month's count down from 31 when Thomas was alive, and she kept a kitchen garden and 4 laying hens and a mule named Article, who had opinions about everything and was right about half of them. It wasn't enough. It had never quite been enough. Not since Thomas died in February of 1882, and she'd sat at this same kitchen table and looked at the numbers and understood very clearly that she was going to have to find a way to make more money than a small cattle operation on 40 acres could reliably produce. She'd started sewing for neighbors within 3 weeks of the funeral. She wasn't proud of how fast she'd had to pivot, but she also wasn't ashamed of it. She was practical. She'd had to become practical in the way that grief sometimes demands fast and complete, like setting a bone. The suing had helped. It had helped enough that she'd kept the loan current for 3 years. Not comfortably, not without months where she sat at this table at midnight doing the arithmetic 3 times because she refused to believe the first 2 answers, but current. Always current. She paid what she owed. She did not ask for extensions. She sat at that table now with her coat still on and her coin purse in front of her, and she did the arithmetic again. Loan payment due in 18 days. Amount $14. Current savings $6.43. Deficit $7.57. She needed 2 more sewing jobs before the end of the month. She had 1 confirmed Mrs. Brower's curtains, $2. She needed $5 more and 57 cents from somewhere. She picked up her pencil and she wrote a list of everyone in Red Hollow who might need sewing work done in the next 18 days. She wrote 12 names. She crossed off 4 immediately. They were connected to Calvin Whitmore in ways she didn't want to negotiate around right now, and she wasn't desperate enough yet to go back to people who'd already turned her down once. She was left with 8 names. She circled 3 she thought were genuinely possible. She would start in the morning. She put the list in her pocket, and she got up, and she went to start supper, and she did not think about what Dora Whitmore had said. She did not think about built to be a burden. She did not think about the way Margaret Aldous had looked at her body like it was a problem someone else should have solved. She thought about thread counts. She thought about the Brower curtains, and whether Mrs. Brower would want a plain hem or a turned one. She was very good at thinking about something else when she needed to. It was one of the things Thomas had always loved about her. "You've got the most useful kind of stubborn I've ever seen, Evie," he'd told her once. "You don't dig your heels in to win. You dig them in to survive." She'd told him that wasn't a compliment. He'd said, "No, darlin', it's better than that. It's a fact." She stood at the stove, and she kept her back straight, and she did not let herself think about how much she missed him. Not tonight. Tonight she needed to be practical. She'd miss him tomorrow. She didn't hear the wagon on the road the next morning until it was already turning into her drive. She was in the yard hanging the laundry she'd washed before dawn, another economy washing before the heat came in, and she turned with a shirt in her hands and saw the wagon coming up the long dirt road to the house, and what she saw made the shirt go still in her grip. It was a Cross Ranch wagon. She knew it the way everyone in 3 counties knew it. The double C burned into the board, the matched bays, the particular way. The Cross Ranch hands sat a wagon seat, like they had somewhere to be, but weren't in a hurry to prove it. She'd seen this wagon in town 100 times. She'd never seen it on her road. The driver was young, 19 maybe. Sunburned neck. Careful expression of a boy following instructions he hadn't entirely been briefed on. He pulled up and took off his hat. "Mrs. Hartwell." "That's me." "Jimmy Alcott, ma'am. I work for Mr. Cross." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. "He asked me to bring this out." She set the shirt down over the line and crossed to the wagon and took the envelope. She opened it standing there in the yard. Inside was a letter. Short. No pleasantries. "Mrs. Hartwell, I am in need of a seamstress for the Cross Ranch. My workers require clothing that fits and holds under hard use. Their families need household linens. I have been told your work is the finest in Red Hollow, and I have no reason to doubt that. I am sending fabric for the first order. Terms and payment to be arranged by your preference. If this is work you're willing to take on, send word with Jimmy. N. Cross." She read it once. She read it again. She looked at the wagon. She had not until this moment fully registered what was loaded in the back of it. She'd seen it peripherally and set it aside while she read the letter, but now she looked at it properly and she felt something strange move through her chest. It was fabric, not remnants, not end bolts. Real fabric cotton in 3 colors, what looked like linen in a gray so soft It was almost silver canvas for work clothes cut from a full bolt. Enough to fill 2 orders, maybe 3. More yardage than she bought in 4 months of careful shopping. She stood there in her yard holding the letter with her coat still on from the early morning cold, and she thought about 17 cents. She thought about the coin purse. She thought about Cecily Pruitt's voice saying, "Is she really trying, or is she just waiting for someone to come along and rescue her?" She thought about pity. About what pity looked like from the outside, charitable, well-intentioned, wrapped in good manners. About what it felt like from the inside, like being told you're broken in the kindest possible voice. She folded the letter. She unfolded it. She read it a 3rd time, and she found the thing that had been sitting in it all along. The thing that wasn't pity. Your work is the finest in Red Hollow, and I have no reason to doubt it. Not I heard you were struggling. Not I thought I might be able to help. Not a single syllable of sympathy or condescension, or the particular brand of generosity that made a person feel smaller for receiving it. Just your work is the finest. Present tense. Stated as fact. She looked at Jimmy Alcott, who was sitting very still on the wagon seat with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a young man who understood that something was being decided and that he had no part in deciding it. "Did Mr. Cross tell you what I was likely to say?" she asked. Jimmy blinked. "He said you might say no, ma'am." "And if I did?" "He said bring the fabric back and don't argue about it." A pause. "He said you'd have a good reason either way, and it wasn't my business to question it." Evelyn looked at the fabric in the wagon. "Tell Mr. Cross," she said slowly, "that I'll need measurements. Chest and inseam for every worker, and I'll need to know whether the household linens are for the main house or the bunkhouses because that changes the weight I'd choose." She paused. "And tell him I'll need his payment terms in writing before I begin. Amount, schedule, and method. I don't work on verbal agreements." Jimmy Alcott stared at her for a moment, with the expression of a boy recalibrating his expectations. "So that is not a yes," Evelyn said. "That is the beginning of a professional conversation. Can you remember all of that?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she could see him mentally writing it down. "Good." She turned back toward the house. "Leave the fabric. I'll look at it while I wait for his response." She heard Jimmy laugh, just a small sound surprised out of him before he got the wagon turned around. She didn't smile until she was back inside. Nathaniel Cross received her conditions before noon. He was at his desk when Jimmy came in and delivered them word for word, with the added editorial observation that Mrs. Hartwell was real specific. Mr. Cross, and she looked at that letter about 4 times before she said anything. Nathaniel Cross said nothing. He picked up his pen. He wrote, "Mrs. Hartwell, measurements will follow by end of week. Linens are for both the main house and the bunkhouses, I'll note, which is which. Payment full amount upon delivery of each completed order. No delays. No partial. If that's agreeable, I'd like to discuss a larger arrangement at your convenience. N. Cross." He handed it to Jimmy and said, "Today." Jimmy went. Pete Daniels, who had been standing in the doorway through all of this, with a saddle catalog in his hand and more awareness than he usually advertised, said, "You going to tell me what that's about?" "Seamstress work," Nathaniel said. "Uh-huh." Pete turned the catalog over in his hands. "The Hartwell woman." Nathaniel looked up. "Jimmy talks," Pete said mildly. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Sit down, Pete. I need you to tell me what you know about Calvin Whitmore and the Hartwell property." Pete Daniels sat. He took his hat off. He said, "How much do you want to know?" "All of it." Pete turned his hat in his hands slowly. This was a gesture he made when he was organizing facts in a way that was going to be unpleasant to deliver. Nathaniel had seen it enough times to know what came next was serious. "Calvin's been after that land for close to 3 years, Pete said. "Started about 6 months after Thomas Hartwell died, near as I can tell. He doesn't want it for the cattle. 40 acres doesn't do much for a man at Calvin's scale. He wants it for the water access. The creek that runs along the south edge of the Hartwell property is the cleanest year-round water source between here and the Caldwell Range. Calvin's east pastures go dry by August most summers. He's losing cattle weight every year because of it. That's the motive, Nathaniel said. Tell me the method. Pete's hands stopped turning the hat. Harold Pruitt holds the loan on the Hartwell property. Has since Thomas took it out in '81. After Thomas died, the interest adjusted twice at renewal. Both times Pruitt called it standard market movement. Pete paused. I checked against 3 other loans from the same period at the same bank. None of them adjusted the same way. Just hers. Nathaniel's pen was still in his hand. He set it down. There's more, Pete said. Go ahead. Calvin sent men out to walk the Hartwell property twice last fall, framed it as a purchase inquiry. She turned them away both times. Pete's jaw tightened slightly. Week after the second time, a section of fence on the south edge of her property came down. She lost 6 cattle through it before she found the gap. She filed a report with Sheriff Larkin. What did Larkin do? Called it deterioration. Pete's voice was flat. The fence was cut, Nathaniel. I talked to Roy Briggs, who rode out to look at it before it was repaired. Clean diagonal cuts. Wire doesn't deteriorate at a diagonal. The room was very quiet. Last month at the Merchants Club, Pete continued, Calvin told 3 men, I have their names, that the Hartwell property would be in his hands by winter. Said it like it was already settled. He looked at his employer. When Jimmy told me about your delivery this morning, I thought you should know all of it. Nathaniel Cross looked at the window. He looked at it for a long time. I need the loan documents, he said. Whatever we can legally access. Original terms, every renewal, every adjustment. I can try. It won't be quick. Try anyway. He picked up his pen again. Then he stopped. Pete, the 6 cattle she lost through the fence. Yes. What were they worth? Pete calculated. $60, $70 maybe, at market. Nathaniel nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else. Pete stood, put his hat back on. He was almost to the door when Nathaniel spoke again. She's behind on the loan. Not yet, Pete said. She's been current, every payment on time. Don't ask me how because I'm not sure. He paused with his hand on the doorframe. Nathaniel, she's been fighting this alone for 3 years, and she doesn't even know the full shape of what she's fighting. She thinks it's just bad luck and a hard season. Nathaniel Cross was quiet. It's not bad luck, Pete said. No, Nathaniel said. It's not. Pete left. Nathaniel sat alone with that for a while. He thought about the letter she'd sent. The precise handwriting. The specific conditions. I don't work on verbal agreements. He thought about what it meant to have learned that lesson, what it cost to learn that lesson in this part of the world as the kind of person she was. I thought about a woman pressing her back against an alley wall so nobody could see her count to 60. He thought about Calvin Whitmore's wife laughing. He thought about the fence cut at a diagonal. He picked up his pen, and he wrote the payment terms, the way he'd told her he would, full amount on delivery, no delays. And then he sat back, and he looked at what he'd written, and he thought, this is not enough. The contract is not enough. The payment terms are not enough. But it was where you started. You started with what you could prove. You started with what she would accept, and she would accept work. She'd made that abundantly clear. She would not accept charity. She would not accept pity. She would not accept the hand that came with strings attached, but she would accept a fair wage for skilled labor, and she would do the work to the standard she set for herself, which from everything Pete said and everything Calloway said was a standard considerably higher than the town had bothered to notice. So, work first. The rest would follow. Jimmy delivered the payment terms that afternoon. Evelyn read them at the kitchen table while Article made his opinions known from the paddock outside. Something had annoyed him. Possibly the cat, possibly. A philosophical grievance, and she read them twice, and then she folded them and set them next to the letter, and she sat there for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Full amount upon delivery. No delays. No partial. He'd used her exact language back at her. She noticed that. She also noticed and told herself to stop noticing that he hadn't pushed. He hadn't tried to close the deal with extra warmth or extra explanation, or the particular energy of a man trying to make himself seem more trustworthy than he was. He'd sent exactly what she'd asked for, in exactly the form she'd asked for it, and left the decision where she'd left it with her. She picked up her pen. Mr. Cross, terms are acceptable. Send measurements and specifications by end of week. I'll have a delivery estimate to you within 5 days of receiving them. First payment upon first delivery as agreed. E. Hartwell. She sent it with the evening when a passing neighbor's boy went toward town. That night, she sorted through the fabric from the wagon. The cotton was good, better than good. The kind of tightly woven cotton that held under hard use and washed clean without losing its shape. The linen was exceptional. She held it up to the lamplight and ran her thumb along the weave and felt the quality in her fingertips. The way you feel a true thing, and she thought he didn't buy this to be charitable. A man buying fabric to make a poor widow feel better about herself buys the cheapest thing that doesn't look cheap. He buys the mid-range. He doesn't buy this. This was bought by someone who cared about the quality of the finished product. She set it down. She thought about that. She told herself it didn't mean anything beyond what it was, a man who ran a serious operation and wanted serious work done and had bought accordingly. That was all. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark, and she listened to Article register his continued philosophical grievances from the paddock, and she thought about the loan payment in 18 days and the 3 names on her list and the arithmetic that didn't quite work yet. And then she thought about how by the end of next week, if the measurement list came as promised, and she worked the hours she intended to work, the arithmetic might work after all. She thought about Thomas. About the way he'd looked at her across a kitchen table, just like this one in the lamplight, just like this, and said, "You'll be all right, Evie. When I'm gone, you'll be more than all right." She'd told him not to say things like that. He'd said, "I'm not saying it to comfort you. I'm saying it because it's true. You're the most capable woman I've ever known, and you've spent 30 years hiding it so men around you don't feel small." She'd cried then. She hadn't known whether she was crying because he was dying, or because he was right, or because nobody had said it out loud before, and she hadn't realized she was waiting to hear it. Maybe all 3. She lay in the dark, and she thought about that, and she thought about a letter that said, "Your work is the finest in Red Hollow, and I have no reason to doubt it." And she thought about the particular quality of that linen, bought by someone who intended to get good use from it, and she thought 18 days. Loan payment in 18 days. She had work to do. The measurement list arrived Thursday. It was thorough, more thorough than she expected. Chest inseam, shoulder width, sleeve length for each of 12 workers, annotated with notes about specific fit issues. Alcott favors left shoulder from old injury. Allow extra. Briggs runs wide through the chest. Don't cut close. Peterson is 17 and still growing, build in room. There was also a separate sheet for the household linens, specifying which rooms were which and what the daily demands on each were, which meant someone had actually thought about how linen gets used, not just how it looks on a shelf. At the bottom of the measurement sheet, in the same careful handwriting, "If the fabric selection I sent isn't right for any of the work clothes, set it aside and send word. I'd rather wait for the right material than rush the wrong one. N.C." Evelyn set that note down. She picked it back up. She read it again. "I'd rather wait for the right material than rush the wrong one." She thought, this is a man who has run an operation long enough to know that shortcuts in materials cost you more in the end than doing it right. This is a man who has made enough mistakes in his life to understand that patience in the early stages is not delay, it is precision. She thought, I know something about that. She put the note with the others. She started cutting patterns. She was deep in the work on a Saturday afternoon. 3 pattern pieces cut, the measurements transferred, the first seams of the canvas work jacket pinned and waiting when she heard a horse on the road. Not a wagon this time. A single horse. She went to the window. She recognized the horse before she recognized the rider, a gray with a distinctive blaze that she'd seen in the Cross Ranch corral when she'd passed on the road to town. The rider was Nathaniel Cross. He was alone. He pulled up at the yard gate and stayed on the horse, which was the correct move. You don't ride into a woman's yard. Uninvited. You stop at the gate and you wait. And he took his hat off when she appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, I apologize for coming without sending word ahead. I'll be brief. She studied him from the doorway. He looked exactly as he looked in town, self-contained, unhurried, with eyes that took in the yard without performing the act of looking. He wasn't cataloging her property. He was just seeing it the way a man who manages land sees land reflexively without meaning to. You can come in if you have something to say, she said. Or you can say it from there. I'll say it from here. He turned his hat in his hands once. I have information about your ranch loan that I think you need to hear. It isn't comfortable information. I won't dress it up. Evelyn's hands were still in her apron pockets. Say it then, she said. He told her, standing at her gate with his hat in his hands and the afternoon light coming level across the yard. Nathaniel Cross told her about Harold Pruitt's adjustments. He told her about the men who'd come to walk her land. He told her about the fence, about the cut, about the angle, about what Roy Briggs had seen before the wire was repaired. He told her what Calvin Whitmore had said at the Merchants Club. He told her all of it plainly without softening the edges. When he finished, the yard was quiet. A mockingbird was working through its catalog somewhere in the oak at the corner of the fence. Article had gone still in the paddock, which he only did when he was paying attention to something. The afternoon light was going gold. Evelyn stood in the doorway with her hands in her apron pockets. The fence, she said. I knew it wasn't deterioration. Larkin told me I was imagining it. You weren't. I know I wasn't. Her voice was flat, not angry, past angry. I've been paying an elevated interest rate for how long? We believe since the first renewal, 18 months after Thomas died. She did the arithmetic, automatically, reflexively, the way she'd been doing arithmetic for 3 years. That's... She stopped. She did it again. That's close to $40 over 3 years. Possibly more. We're still getting the records. $40. $40 she'd scraped and stitched and gone without to pay an interest rate that had been manipulated by a man who wanted her land and had a banker in his pocket to help take it. You said we're, she said. Who else is working on this? My foreman, Pete Daniels. He's the one who first put it together. Why? Her eyes were direct, uncompromising. Why is your foreman spending his time on my loan documents? Nathaniel Cross met her eyes without hesitation. Because I asked him to. And why did you ask him to? A pause. Not an uncertain pause, a considered one. Because what Calvin Whitmore is doing is fraud, he said. And I don't tolerate fraud in my county. And because... He stopped. Started again. Because I was in Callaway's on Tuesday morning, Mrs. Hartwell. I heard what was said to you. The mockingbird continued its catalog. Article moved once in the paddock and went still again. Evelyn looked at Nathaniel Cross for a long moment. And the contract, she said. The sewing work, is that part of this? Is that something else dressed up as work? No. His voice was immediate and firm. The contract is exactly what I said it was. I need a skilled seamstress. You are one. The two things exist at the same time, but they're not the same thing. She looked at him. She was very good at reading men. She had learned it the hard way. You learned it when you were a woman running a ranch alone, negotiating with suppliers who tested you, dealing with a bank that didn't respect you, managing hands who needed to see that you meant what you said. You learned to read the difference between a man who was performing honesty and a man who simply was honest. And the difference was subtle, but it was there, and she'd developed an instinct for it that had saved her several times. She read Nathaniel Cross. He was telling the truth. Not all of it, maybe. There was something else behind the gray eyes, something careful and unexpressed that she recognized without being able to name it. But the truth he was telling her was real. I have Thomas's original loan documents, she said. Every paper he signed. I've kept everything. Something moved in his expression, approval or something close to it. That's important. Thomas told me never throw away a document that has your name on it. She paused. He said men who want to cheat you count on you not keeping records. He was right. He was right about most things. She said it simply, without performance. Grief clean and private the way it was after 3 years, not a wound anymore, but a presence. A shape in the room you'd learn to navigate around. Nathaniel Cross saw it. He didn't comment on it. She appreciated that. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Your original documents when you're ready to share them, and time to get the records we're collecting into a form that makes the case clearly." He replaced his hat. "And I need you to know this doesn't change the contract. Whatever happens with Whitmore, the sewing work is yours as long as you want it. It was never conditional." She studied him one final moment. "Mr. Cross," she said, "if this turns out to be the most elaborate act of pity I've ever encountered, I want you to know that I will be considerably angrier about it than I was about Calloway's." The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I have 11,000 acres and more trouble than I can keep up with. I don't have the time or the temperament for elaborate." She almost smiled. She didn't. "Monday," she said. "Send Jimmy with a fresh note on the linen specs. I have questions about thread count before I start cutting." He turned the horse toward the gate. "He'll be there by 8. He rode out. She stood in the way and watched the gray horse and its rider go down the long road until the dust settled back onto the ground behind them. Then she went back inside. She went back to the cutting table. She picked up the pattern piece she'd set down when she heard the hoofbeats. She held it in her hands. She thought about $40. She thought about a fence cut at a diagonal. She thought about Calvin Whitmore at the Merchants Club saying her property will be in my hands by winter, like it was already done, like she was already defeated, like 3 years of fighting alone in the particular silence of a woman nobody was watching meant she was finished. She thought you miscalculated. She picked up her shears. She started cutting. Outside somewhere on the road east of town, the hoofbeats faded. And in the Cross Ranch office at a desk covered in careful notes and loan records, and the beginnings of something that was going to be very difficult for certain people in Red Hollow to explain, Nathaniel Cross sat down. And he started building the case. The measurements came Monday as promised, but it was what came with them that Evelyn wasn't prepared for. Jimmy Alcott arrived at 7:58. She was starting to suspect the boy had been specifically instructed about punctuality, and he handed her the linen specifications she'd asked for, along with a second envelope she hadn't requested. Thicker than the first. Sealed. "Mr. Cross said you'd know what it was," Jimmy said with the expression of someone who definitely knew what it was and had been told not to say. She opened it at the kitchen table after he left. Inside were copies. Careful hand-copied transcriptions of loan records from Pruitt's Bank, not the originals, those were locked behind a counter. She had no legal access to, but side-by-side comparisons. The interest terms on her loan at each renewal set, next to 3 other property loans from the same period at the same bank. The same loan officer. The same supposed market conditions. The numbers were not the same. Her rate had gone up 7% at the first renewal, 8.5% at the second. The other 3 loans in the comparison had moved less than 2% combined across the same period. She sat with those numbers for a long time. She'd known something was wrong. She'd felt it the way you feel weather coming, that particular pressure in the chest that has no logical source yet. She'd gone over her own copies of the documents a dozen times in 3 years, looking for the thing she couldn't name. She'd told herself she was being paranoid. She'd told herself she didn't understand finance well enough to question a banker. She'd told herself a lot of things that were easier than the alternative. The alternative was sitting in front of her right now in black ink on white paper. She pulled Thomas's original loan documents from the tin on the shelf. The same tin where she kept the cross payments. The same tin Thomas had pressed into her hands the week before he died and said, "Don't lose these, Evie. Don't ever lose these." And she laid them next to the comparison sheet. She was still sitting there 2 hours later when she heard another horse on the road. Not Jimmy this time. She knew Jimmy's rhythm by now. This was different, faster, and pulling up harder than someone who'd come with a routine delivery. She was at the window before the thought completed. It was Roy Briggs. One of the Cross Ranch hands, older, weathered, the one Pete Daniels trusted with anything that needed discretion. He'd been out to her property twice before on cross business, and he'd always been careful and quiet, and he'd always stayed on his horse. I wasn't staying on his horse today. He was already dismounting when she got to the door. "Mrs. Hartwell." He touched his hat, but his eyes were moving, checking the road behind him, checking the tree line to the east. I need you to come inside, ma'am, please." She stepped back without asking why. You didn't ask why when a man looked at a tree line like that. He came in. She closed the door. Mr. Cross sent me, he said, keeping his voice low even inside the house. Calvin Whitmore went to see Pruitt yesterday afternoon. Private meeting back office lasted about an hour. One of our people saw him go in. He paused. This morning, Harold Pruitt filed an acceleration notice on your loan. Evelyn went very still. He's calling it in full, Roy said. Not the monthly payment, the whole remaining balance. He's claiming a technical default on a covenant in the original loan agreement. Says the livestock numbers on the property have fallen below the threshold Thomas agreed to in 1881. Her mouth was dry. The covenant. The livestock threshold. Yes, ma'am. Thomas agreed to maintain 30 head of cattle or equivalent livestock as a condition of the loan. Yes, ma'am. She had 22 cattle. She had known about the covenant. She had been working toward rebuilding the herd for 2 years. She had never missed a payment, never been formally notified of a covenant concern, never been given the opportunity to cure the default, the way the original agreement specified she had the right to do. How long, she said. 30 days to pay the full balance or vacate. The number hit her like cold water. The full remaining balance on the Hartwell Ranch loan was $260. She did not have $260. She did not have a quarter of $260. She had $6.43 and the start of a contract that had been running for less than 3 weeks. Mr. Cross, she said. He knows. He sent me the minute he heard. He wants you to come to the ranch this afternoon if you're able. Roy's voice was steady, the voice of a man delivering hard news, the same way he delivered all news, because in his experience, panic was contagious and calm was a choice. He said to tell you he's not without options. He said to tell you not to make any decisions until you talk to him. She looked at Roy Briggs. She looked at the documents on her kitchen table. Thomas's original agreement, the comparison sheet, the numbers that proved what was being done to her, and that would mean nothing, absolutely nothing, if she lost the property in 30 days before anyone could act on them. Tell him I'll be there at 2, she said. Roy was back on his horse and down the road in under 4 minutes. Evelyn stood at the kitchen table. She put both hands flat on the surface the way she'd done the morning she'd decided to start sewing for neighbors 3 days after Thomas's funeral, when the grief was still so raw it felt like a physical wound, and she'd stood at this exact table and said out loud to no one, "All right then. What can be done?" She said it again now, out loud, to no one. All right then. What can be done? She gathered every document in the tin. She put them in a leather satchel Thomas had used for ranch business. She changed out of her work clothes. She fed Article and the hens because animals didn't wait for human crises to need feeding, and then she hitched the wagon and she drove east toward the Cross Ranch with the satchel on the seat beside her and the arithmetic running in her head and nowhere near enough to show for it yet. She was angry. She had been a lot of things in 3 years. Grief-stricken, exhausted, lonely, humiliated in a fabric store. But this was a different quality of feeling entirely. This was the specific anger of a woman who had done everything right, who had paid every payment on time, who had kept every record, who had rebuilt from almost nothing, with nothing but her own hands and her own stubbornness, and had never not once asked this town for a single thing she hadn't earned, and they were still going to try to take it. She held that anger carefully, the way you hold a lamp in a wind, not letting it go out, not letting it burn the whole thing down. She was going to need it. Pete Daniels met her at the gate and took her wagon without saying much, which told her that the situation in the Cross Ranch office was serious enough that pleasantries had been suspended by mutual unspoken agreement. Nathaniel was at his desk when she walked in. He stood when she entered, not performatively, just reflexively, the way men of a certain generation and character stood when a woman came into a room and he looked at her face and he said, "You're angry." "I am," she said. "Good." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit down. I need to show you something." She sat. She put the satchel on her knees. He put 3 documents on the desk in front of her. "The acceleration notice is technically valid," he said, And he said it directly without softening it because she'd made it clear from the beginning that she preferred the unvarnished version. The covenant exists. The livestock threshold exists. Pruitt has the legal right to call the loan if the terms aren't met. I know, she said. However, he put his finger on the second document. The original agreement also contains a cure period, 30 days notice before acceleration, during which the borrower has the right to remedy the default. Pruitt filed the acceleration without providing the 30-day cure notice first. He went straight to the final demand. Evelyn looked at the document. She found the clause. She read it twice. He skipped a step, she said. He skipped a required step, which means the acceleration notice as filed is procedurally invalid. Nathaniel paused. That doesn't make it go away. It makes it contestable. A judge in Fort Worth would look at this and give you a minimum of 60 additional days while the procedure is corrected, possibly 90. And in 60 days, we need to either cure the default or make the acceleration notice itself inadmissible by demonstrating that it was filed in bad faith as part of a broader fraudulent scheme. He leaned back. Which brings me to the third document. The third document was longer, denser. She picked it up. That, Nathaniel said, is a letter from a lawyer in Fort Worth named Ellison. He handles land fraud cases. Pete contacted him Friday. He reviewed what we have so far, the interest rate comparison, the timeline of events, Whitmore's statement at the Merchants Club, the fence incident, and he says we have the beginning of a viable case, not a finished one, but a beginning. Evelyn read the letter. She read it carefully the way she read everything that mattered. She found the paragraph that said the pattern of conduct described, if substantiated by original documentation, would constitute actionable fraud under Texas civil statutes. She set it down. Original documentation, she said. Yes. She opened the satchel. She put Thomas's loan documents on the desk. Nathaniel Cross looked at the stack of papers. He looked at her. Everything, he said. Everything, she said. Every document with my name or Thomas's name on it going back to 1878. He told me not to throw anything away. She paused. I didn't throw anything away. Something moved through Nathaniel's expression that she'd been starting to recognize that particular quality of careful attention that wasn't the same as admiration, but was adjacent to it in the way that respect and admiration are adjacent without being identical. Evelyn, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name, and neither of them remarked on it. I want to ask you something directly. Ask. I can provide a short-term loan to cure the livestock default. Enough to bring your herd back to 30 head. It would be structured as a legitimate business transaction documented with terms you set repayable against the sowing contract over 12 months. He held her gaze. It keeps the acceleration notice from being refiled on valid grounds while Ellison builds the fraud case. It buys us time. She looked at him. Us, she said. He didn't look away. Yes, that word is doing a lot of work, Mr. Cross. I know it is. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the office window, she could hear the yard, the particular sounds of a working ranch in the afternoon, horses and tack and men calling to each other across distance, the organic sound of a place that was alive and functioning. She thought about her own yard, about the 40 acres that Thomas had bought with borrowed money and the belief that work was enough, about 22 cattle where 30 should be, about a fence cut at a diagonal, while a banker adjusted her interest rate in a back office and a man at a club told people her land was already his. She thought about Thomas's voice. You'll be more than all right. She thought he did not tell me I'd be all right because it would be easy. He told me because he knew exactly how hard it was going to be, and he believed I was harder. The terms, she said. I set them. You set them. In writing. Before any money changes hands. Of course. And the sowing contract remains separate, not collateral, not connected to the loan in any legal sense. Agreed. She picked up her pen from where it had been sitting in the satchel. She'd brought it without thinking, habit, the way you brought your tools when you went to work, and she said, then let's write the terms. Nathaniel Cross almost smiled. He reached for his own pen instead. They spent the next 40 minutes at that desk with the documents spread between them, And it was the most productive 40 minutes Evelyn had spent with another person since Thomas died, and she tried very hard not to think about that. She was back on the road home by 4 o'clock, the signed loan agreement in the satchel, and the beginnings of something that felt cautiously provisionally like solid ground under her feet. She was halfway between the Cross Ranch and home when she saw the rider. He was coming from town moving fast, and he pulled up when he saw her wagon with the particular abruptness of someone who'd been looking for her specifically. It was Calvin Whitmore. He was 53, heavy through the chest, with the prosperous coloring of a man who ate well and slept well and hadn't questioned either in a long time. He wore good clothes and rode a good horse, and he had the expression of a man who had never once in his life been told no by anyone he considered beneath him. He looked at her wagon. He looked at the direction she'd come from. His jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. She kept the wagon stopped. She kept her hands easy on the reins. She did not give him a single thing in her expression. "I understand you received some difficult news this morning." "I received correspondence from the bank," she said. "Yes, I hope you'll take it in the spirit it was intended." His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who'd been having this category of conversation for decades. "Harold has a responsibility to his institution. When a loan falls out of compliance—" "The cure period," she said. He blinked, just slightly. "The original agreement specifies a 30-day cure notice before acceleration can be filed," she said. "Mr. Pruitt doesn't appear to have provided that notice. I imagine his lawyer will want to look into that before things go much further." Calvin Whitmore looked at her. He looked at her the way men looked at things that had moved when they expected them to stay still. "You've been talking to someone," he said. "I've been reading my documents," she said. "Thomas kept meticulous records. I've kept them since." She paused. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Whitmore? I have animals to feed before dark." He leaned forward slightly on his horse. The practiced smoothness had developed a small crack in it just at the edges. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to be direct with you. That land is going to change hands eventually. The only question is whether it happens in a way that leaves you with something, or in a way that leaves you with nothing. I'm offering you a fair price, considerably more than the outstanding loan balance, and a clean break. You could start somewhere fresh, somewhere easier." She looked at him. She thought about the fence, cut at a diagonal, 6 cattle through a gap she hadn't made. She thought about $40 in manipulated interest that she'd paid out of money she'd stitched and pressed and hemmed in lamplight while he sat in a warm house and waited for her to break. "Mr. Whitmore," she said very pleasantly, "I think you've mistaken me for a woman who's finished fighting. I'd encourage you to correct that mistake before it becomes expensive." She gathered the reins. "Good afternoon." She clicked to the horse and drove past him. She did not look back. She could feel his eyes on her back for 100 yards. She kept her spine straight and her eyes forward and her hands easy on the reins, and she breathed through her nose the way Thomas had taught her, and she counted not to 60 this time, because she wasn't keeping herself from falling apart. She was keeping herself from turning around. Because what she wanted to do, what the 3 years of scraped payments and cut fences and manipulated interest rates in Callaway's store and 17 cents in her pocket were clamoring at her to do, was turn around and say a great deal more. She didn't. Not yet. Not until Ellison's case was built. Not until she had something in her hands that was stronger than words. She drove home. She told Nathaniel about the encounter the next morning, in a note practical spare, the way she wrote everything, and his response came back by noon. "He knows you've been to see me. He'll move faster now. So will we. Ellison is coming from Fort Worth Friday. Can you meet here at 10? Bring everything. NC." She wrote back, "I'll be there." The week that followed was the strangest of the 3 years she'd spent alone on the Hartwell ranch, because for the first time she wasn't alone in what she was doing, and she didn't entirely know what to do with that. She worked. She always worked. The cross order was progressing. The canvas jackets were finished and pressed. 3 of the linen sets were cut and ready for their final seams, and she'd taken on 2 additional small jobs from the list she'd made that first desperate night, because $260 didn't stop being a threat just because there was a lawyer in Fort Worth now. But around the work, something else was happening. Notes came. Daily, sometimes twice a day. Not social notes. Nothing that announced itself as personal, but the kind of notes that accumulate a texture of their own when you read them in sequence. Monday, Ellison will need a clear timeline of every interaction with Pruitt's Bank since Thomas's death. Can you reconstruct dates? She could. She did. She sent back 4 pages. Tuesday, Roy tells me the south fence line needs repair. I'd like to send 2 men Friday afternoon if you're agreeable. No charge, consider it a neighbor's obligation. I should have offered sooner. She held that note for a while. She thought about the fence cut at a diagonal. She thought about 6 cattle she'd never gotten back. She wrote, agreeable. Thank you. Wednesday. The linen samples you sent with Jimmy are exceptional. Pete's wife asked me to tell you. She has opinions about quality, and they are not mild opinions. Despite everything, the loan, the lawyer, the 30-day clock. Calvin Whitmore's eyes on her back on the road, she had smiled at that. She hadn't been able to help it. Thursday, nothing. She found herself noticing the absence and told herself firmly that was not information. Friday, she arrived at the Cross Ranch at 9:55. Ellison was a small, precise man from Fort Worth who wore a dark suit and carried a briefcase that looked like it had witnessed significant history and expected to witness more. He shook her hand without the particular hesitation some men used when deciding whether to take a woman seriously, and he asked his questions in a rapid, organized sequence that told her he'd already reviewed what Pete had sent him and was filling specific gaps rather than fishing generally. She answered everything directly. She laid documents on the table in the order he asked for them. She reconstructed conversations with dates and context. When he asked her something she wasn't certain about, she said so precisely. I believe it was the 2nd week of October, but I'd want to check my records before I'd swear to it, rather than approximating, because she understood instinctively that a lawyer needed the difference between certain and probable clearly marked. At one point, Ellison set his pen down and looked at her with an expression she didn't immediately categorize. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, how long have you been managing this property alone? 3 years and 4 months, she said. And these records? He gestured at the documents spread across the table. You maintained all of this yourself. Thomas taught me the system. I continued it. It's extraordinary, he said simply. She looked at him. It's necessary, she said. There's a difference. Ellison smiled. It was a smile, but it was genuine. He picked up his pen. Nathaniel, sitting across the table, said nothing. But she felt him look at her. She didn't look back. The meeting lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Ellison gathered his papers and told them what he had enough to file for an injunction against the acceleration notice based on procedural failure, which would extend her time on the property while the fraud case was built. The fraud case itself, the interest manipulation, the coordinated pressure campaign, the fence incident would take longer. It was strong. It was not fast. How long? Evelyn asked. For the injunction I can file Monday, hear from a judge by Wednesday. Ellison closed his briefcase. For the underlying fraud case, if Whitmore fights it, and he will fight it 6 months, possibly 8. 6 to 8 months. She did the arithmetic. 6 months of cross-contract income, minus expenses, minus loan interest at the legitimate rate. The numbers were tight, very tight. But they weren't impossible. Nothing was impossible if it wasn't finished. File Monday, she said. She stayed at the ranch longer than she'd planned. Not because the meeting ran over, they finished with Ellison by 1, but because Pete Daniels appeared in the doorway as the lawyer was leaving and said with the careful casualness of a man delivering news, he knows will not be received calmly. You might want to hear this before you head home, Mrs. Hartwell. She looked at him. Town's talking, he said. She waited. Calvin Whitmore was at the barber this morning. Told 4 men, including the editor of the Red Hollow Courier, that you'd taken out a loan from Nathaniel Cross because you couldn't manage the ranch on your own. He's calling it... Pete paused. He used the word dependent. He said a woman in her position couldn't be expected to resist an offer from a wealthy man, and that it was only a matter of time before you sold up, and that whatever arrangement you'd entered into with Cross was the reason you were holding out. The room went quiet. Evelyn sat with that for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "He saw me on the road yesterday." "Yes, ma'am." "And by this morning he'd turned it into a story about my character." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at Nathaniel. I was watching her with the careful attention of a man who was not going to say anything until she indicated what she needed said, and she recognized that quality as one of the rarer ones. The ability to be present in a difficult moment without filling it with your own noise. "The Courier," she said. "Who's the editor?" "Fellow named Marcus Webb," Pete said. "He's not a bad man. He prints what sells." "Does he print corrections?" Pete blinked. "Ma'am, if a story he prints turns out to be factually wrong, does he correct it?" Pete looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Evelyn. "He has," Nathaniel said slowly. "Good." She picked up her satchel. "Then he's going to get the chance to practice." She stood. "I'm going to town," she said. "Evelyn," Nathaniel started. "I'm not going to do anything that hurts the case," she said. "I'm going to go talk to a newspaper editor about the difference between a business loan and dependency, and I'm going to bring my documentation, and I'm going to let him decide which version of this story is more interesting." She met Nathaniel's eyes. "I've been quiet for 3 years. I've been careful and patient and quiet, and it has not protected me. He cut my fence and raised my interest rate and called my loan while I was being quiet." Nobody in the room said anything. "I'm going to town," she said again more quietly. "I'll be careful." She walked to the door. "Pete," Nathaniel said. "Sir." "Hitch her wagon." Pete went. Evelyn was already moving. Marcus Webb was 40, ink-stained, and had the particular wary attention of a man who'd learned that people who came to see him unannounced were either going to make his week or ruin it, and he wasn't always able to tell which until it was too late. Evelyn Hartwell walked into his office at 3 in the afternoon with a leather satchel and an expression he would later describe to his wife as, "the quietest fury I've ever seen on a human face, and I've been in this business 20 years. She sat across from his desk. She opened the satchel. She laid documents on his desk in a precise, ordered sequence. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She said, "Mr. Webb, I understand you spoke with Calvin Whitmore this morning. I'd like to give you the other version of the story with documentation. I think your readers might find it considerably more interesting." Marcus Webb looked at the documents. He looked at Evelyn. He reached for his notepad, and for the first time in 3 years, Evelyn Hartwell told her story, clearly, factually, with the exact dates and figures and documented evidence of a woman who had kept every record and trusted no one's word over paper to someone who had a press and knew how to use it. When she finished, Marcus Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Hartwell, can I ask you something that's not for print?" "You can ask." "Why did you wait this long?" She looked at him. "Because I didn't have enough yet," she said. "I'm not interested in being believed. I'm interested in being right. There's a difference." Marcus Webb looked at the documents spread across his desk. He looked at her. "There is a difference," he agreed. He picked up his pen. Outside on the main street of Red Hollow, the afternoon went on the way. Afternoons did wagons and foot traffic, and the ordinary sound of a town that had been telling a story about a widow for 3 years without ever asking her for her version. That was about to change. And in a back office on the other side of town, Calvin Whitmore had not yet heard what was happening in the newspaper editor's office, but he was going to. The Courier ran the story on Saturday morning. Marcus Webb had not written it the way Evelyn expected. She'd expected careful. She'd expected measured. She'd expected the kind of journalism that hedged every sentence with allegedly and according to sources, until the truth was so padded it couldn't bruise anyone. That was not what Marcus Webb wrote. He wrote the numbers. He wrote the dates. He wrote the interest rate comparison line by line, loan by loan. And he let the arithmetic speak with the particular eloquence that only facts arranged in sequence can manage. He wrote about the acceleration notice and the missing cure period. He wrote about the fence, carefully attributing it to a source with direct knowledge of the physical evidence. And he wrote about Calvin Whitmore's statement at the Merchants Club with the names of 3 witnesses attached. He did not write Calvin Whitmore's version of events, because Calvin Whitmore's version of events Webb had written in the final paragraph did not come with documentation. Evelyn read the paper at her kitchen table, with her coffee going cold beside her. Then she read it again. Then she set it down and sat very still for a moment, the way you sit when something you've been carrying alone for a long time has just been put down in public where other people can see it, and you're not entirely sure yet what it feels like to have your hands empty. It felt like the beginning of something. It also felt like a bell that could not be unrung. She'd known that when she walked into Webb's office. She'd known it, and she'd gone anyway, because 3 years of careful quiet had produced a cut fence and a fraudulent interest rate and a 30-day notice, and she was finished conducting herself as though her restraint was going to be rewarded. She put on her coat and she went to feed the animals. She was in the paddock with Article, who had opinions about the morning, as he did about all mornings when she heard the first wagon come up the road. It was not Jimmy Alcott. It was Nathaniel Cross. He pulled up at the gate, stepped down, and came into the yard with the paper folded under his arm and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not alarm, not anger, something more complicated than either of those. "You read it," she said. "I did." He stopped a few feet from her. "Calvin will have read it by 7. I know. He's going to respond. Probably not through the paper." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it moving faster than the surface. "Immediately correctly this time, and he'll find a judge he knows to expedite it." "Can Ellison stop it?" "The injunction will slow it. It won't stop it permanently. We need the fraud case to be stronger before the injunction expires." He looked at her. "Evelyn, what made you go to Webb without telling me first?" She looked back at him. "Because it was my decision to make," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "You're right, it was." He didn't say it with the deflated quality of a man conceding a point he disagrees with. He said it like a man updating a fact. "I'm not here to argue about it. I'm here because Roy Briggs saw Calvin Whitmore ride into town at 6:30 this morning, and he didn't go to the bank." "Where did he go?" "Larkin's office." Sheriff Larkin, who had looked at a fence cut at a diagonal and called it deterioration. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "What would he want with Larkin?" "That's what I want to know." Nathaniel folded the paper and put it in his coat. "I have someone watching, but I wanted you to know before you heard it from someone else." He paused. "I also wanted to ask you something." She waited. "Last night," he said. "Did anything happen here? Anything unusual? Any riders on the road? Any sounds you didn't recognize?" She went still. "Why?" "Because Calvin Whitmore is not a man who responds to public embarrassment by sitting quietly and accepting it. He responds by escalating." His voice was careful, deliberate. "And you are currently alone on 40 acres with evidence in your kitchen that could put Harold Pruitt in front of a judge." She understood what he was asking. She understood what was underneath the asking, the concern that moved through the question, like current through wire, contained but present. "Nothing happened last night," she said. "All right." He wasn't entirely satisfied. She could see that. He was managing it. "I'd like to station Roy Briggs on the road east of your property for the next few nights. You wouldn't see him. He'd be in the tree line. He's done it before for the ranch when we've had trouble." He met her eyes. "I'm asking, not arranging." She thought about the tin on her shelf. Thomas's documents, the comparison sheets, Ellison's letter, everything that mattered, everything they needed sitting in a kitchen on 40 acres of land with one woman and a mule. "Ask Roy if he minds the night air," she said. The corner of Nathaniel's mouth moved. "He was born in it," he said. "I'll tell him." He turned to go back to the gate. "Nathaniel," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For Ellison, for the loan, for Pete and Roy and all of it." She said it plainly, without embellishment, because she'd decided somewhere in the last week that the same precision she applied to documents she was going to start applying to things that mattered and were true. "I don't say that easily." "I know you don't," he said. That's why it means something when you do. He went back to his horse. She went back to Article, who had been waiting with the patience of an animal that understood people needed extra time sometimes and was prepared to judge them for it later. Calvin Whitmore's response came faster than either of them expected, and it came from a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. It wasn't legal. Not directly. By Sunday afternoon, the story circulating in Red Hollow was not the one in the Courier. It was a different story, the kind that travels faster than print, because it moves mouth to ear, because it doesn't need documentation, because it lives in the particular register of suggestion and implication that leaves no evidence of its origin. The story was this. Evelyn Hartwell was not fighting for her ranch. Evelyn Hartwell was angling for a wealthy husband, and Nathaniel Cross was either naive enough to be played or knew exactly what he was doing and had his own reasons for it that didn't reflect well on either of them. Cecily Pruitt said it at church. Dora Whitmore said it at the dry goods counter. Margaret Aldis said it in the specific social spaces where women's reputations were constructed and demolished with the efficiency of a well-run operation. And she said it with the warm concern of someone simply sharing a worry, which was the most dangerous possible delivery, because it gave the listener the option of agreeing without feeling like they were participating in anything unkind. Evelyn heard about it Monday morning when she went to deliver the Brower curtains. Mrs. Brower, a sensible, broad-shouldered German woman who had been in Red Hollow for 20 years and had the social patience of someone who'd learned to distinguish between weather and climate, opened her door, took the curtains, examined a seam with the appreciation of a woman who knew quality when she handled it, and then said with the directness of someone who had decided that honesty was the more useful form of kindness, "You should know what they're saying, Evelyn, before you hear it from someone less friendly." Evelyn stood on the porch and listened to the full version. When Mrs. Brower finished, Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does anyone believe it?" Mrs. Brower considered this with genuine honesty. "Some do, some want to." She paused. "The ones who believe the Courier, the ones Calvin made look foolish, they don't." "How many is that?" "More than you might expect." Mrs. Brower held the curtains against her chest with the comfortable authority of a woman in her own home. "Evelyn, you should also know that 3 women asked me this morning where you do your sewing work, because of the curtains." She paused again. "I gave them your name." Evelyn looked at her. "I gave them your name," Mrs. Brower repeated simply. Evelyn pressed her lips together for a moment. Not against tears, she was past that with this woman, past performing composure she didn't need to perform. Against something else. Against the particular overwhelming quality of being seen plainly and without fanfare by someone who had no reason to bother. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Mrs. Brower said. "Thank the curtains. They're doing the work." Evelyn almost laughed. She was surprised by it, the laugh that nearly came spontaneous and real. She couldn't remember the last time something had almost surprised a laugh out of her. She drove home. She wrote to Nathaniel. Not about the rumor he'd hear about it from Pete by noon anyway. She wrote about something else. A question that had been forming for 3 days, and that she was going to ask directly because she'd decided directness was what she had left after 3 years of calibrated silence. "Nathaniel, I need to know if the damage being done to your reputation by your association with this matter is going to cost you something you're not telling me. I would rather know than have you protect me from information I need. E.H." The response came back the same afternoon in handwriting that was slightly faster than usual, like a man who'd written immediately. "Evelyn, my reputation in this county is built on 11,000 acres and 30 years of work, and no one is taking it apart with gossip. Least of all, people connected to Calvin Whitmore. Don't manage your decisions around my comfort. I'm not fragile, and I'm not naive, and I knew what association with this matter would cost when I walked into it. That was my decision to make. N.C." She read it twice. She heard under the words something she didn't examine too carefully yet. She wrote back, "Understood. Ellison sent word the injunction was granted this morning. We have 90 days. His response: "I know. Pete told me an hour ago. 90 days is enough. How are you?" She sat with that question for a moment. "How are you?" Two words that should have been simple, and were not simple at all, coming from this man, at this point in this particular sequence of events. She wrote, "working," which is the same as fine for me. He wrote, "I know." Same here. She put the note in the tin with the others and went back to work. The first twist came on Wednesday, and it came from the last direction anyone expected. Harold Pruitt walked into Marcus Webb's office at 10 in the morning and asked to speak privately. Webb, who had the instinct of a man who'd been in journalism long enough to know that the person who comes to you voluntarily is always more interesting than the person you chase, closed his door and took out his notepad. Pete Daniels heard about it by noon. Pete told Nathaniel by 1. Nathaniel rode to Evelyn's property by 2, and he told her standing at her gate in the afternoon heat, with the controlled urgency of a man who understood that what he was about to say changed the shape of everything. "Pruitt wants to talk," he said. She stared at him. "To Webb." He went to Webb first. Webb convinced him to talk to Ellison instead. "Pruitt's in Fort Worth right now." She processed this. "He's turning. He's scared," Nathaniel said. The Courier story named him. Not directly. Webb was careful, but anyone who knows how to read between lines knows exactly what those interest rate comparisons mean for the man who signed off on them. He paused. Calvin Whitmore apparently told Pruitt that any legal consequences would land entirely on Pruitt's shoulders. That Calvin had structured it so that his own involvement was verbal-only suggestions, not instructions. Nothing on paper. Evelyn understood immediately. He used Pruitt as the mechanism and kept himself clean. "That's what Pruitt is telling Ellison right now." Nathaniel's voice was steady, but she could hear the weight in it. The weight of a situation that had just become both better and more dangerous simultaneously. If Pruitt testifies to the arrangement, the fraud case against Calvin becomes very strong. If Calvin finds out Pruitt is talking before we're ready, he'll destroy him, Evelyn said. Or he'll destroy the evidence Pruitt can provide. He met her eyes. Ellison needs 2 more weeks to build the case around Pruitt's testimony before we can afford to have Calvin know about it. 2 weeks. While Calvin Whitmore ran his rumor campaign through every social channel in Red Hollow. While the injunction held but wouldn't hold forever. While the clock ran on 90 days. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Nothing you haven't already given," he said. "Ellison has the documents. Pruitt has the testimony. Roy is on your road at night." He paused. "I need you to go about your life normally. Take the jobs Mrs. Brower sent you. Be seen. Let Calvin think his campaign is working, that you're isolated, that you're wavering." She looked at him. "You want me to look weak. I want you to look like someone who hasn't figured out that the trap is already sprung on the other end." He said it with the precision of someone who'd been thinking about this. "Can you do that?" She thought about Margaret Aldis's voice. She thought about 3 years of being underestimated by people who'd mistaken her patience for incapacity. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I've been doing that for 3 years without even trying. I think I can manage 2 more weeks." Something shifted in his expression. Something she was running out of ways to not name. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you have." He left. She went inside and picked up her work, and she thought 2 weeks. 58 days left on the injunction after that. Everything needed to be in place. Everything needed to hold. She started sewing. She sewed like it was the only thing keeping the ground solid under her feet, which in several practical senses it was. The 2 weeks were the hardest of the entire 3 years. Not because anything catastrophic happened, because nothing happened, and waiting without showing that you're waiting. When someone is actively working to dismantle your life is a particular and exhausting form of discipline. Calvin Whitmore escalated the social campaign. Through Dora and Margaret and Cecily, through the particular machinery of small-town reputation that operates below the level of anything you can counter directly. He pushed the narrative of a desperate woman making poor decisions. He told the Merchants Club that the Courier story was the work of a man who'd been fed selective information by a widow with an agenda. He implied in the carefully deniable way he did everything that Nathaniel Cross's judgment was compromised. Nathaniel Cross said nothing publicly. Evelyn said nothing publicly. They corresponded daily. The notes had changed, not in subject, still practical, still grounded in the business of the case and the contract, but in texture. The way a conversation changes when two people have been through something difficult together, and the difficulty has burned off whatever surface politeness remained, and left something more direct underneath. He wrote Webb told Pete that 3 more people have asked him about the courier story. Not to dispute it, to understand it better. The arithmetic is doing work. She wrote Mrs. Delacroix commissioned her daughter's fall dresses yesterday. She brought her sister. Her sister wants curtains. I've been booked 2 weeks out. He wrote, that's the answer to the rumor. Not argument. Evidence. She wrote, Thomas used to say that. He said a life well lived was the only argument worth making. He wrote after a pause that she could feel even in a written note. He sounds like he was a good man. She held that for a long time before she responded. He was, she wrote finally. He would have liked you, I think. You're both stubborn in the same direction. She sent it before she could reconsider. His response came the next morning, and it was only 4 words, but 4 words can carry an extraordinary amount if they're chosen correctly. That means something. Thank you. She put that note in the tin. She went back to work. The second twist came on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days into the waiting period, and it came from Calvin Whitmore himself. He came to her property. Not with riders this time. Not with the indirect pressure of a banker and a fence and a rumor campaign. He came alone in his good clothes on his good horse, and he tied the horse at her gate, and he walked up to her door, and he knocked. She opened it. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hands, a gesture that would have looked like humility on a different man, and on him looked like a tool, and he said, May I come in? Mrs. Hartwell, I'd like to speak with you privately. She looked at him. She thought about Ellison, about Pruitt in Fort Worth, about the 2 weeks that weren't quite finished yet. She thought about Roy Briggs in the tree line on the East Road, who was not close enough to see her door. She thought about the tin on the shelf with everything in it. You can speak from here, she said. Something moved in his face. He recalibrated. I've been thinking about how this situation has developed, he said with the voice of a man who had rehearsed this. And I believe there's been some misunderstanding on both sides. I'd like to make you a new offer. A generous one. One that... Mr. Whitmore. Her voice was quiet. I want to ask you something directly. He stopped. The fence, she said. The south section. The 6 cattle I lost. His expression didn't change. He was good at that. I don't know what you're referring to. I think you do, she said. I think you know exactly what I'm referring to, and I think you've been certain for 3 years that I couldn't prove it. And I think you came here today because something has changed, and you're not certain anymore. She held his gaze. Am I wrong? The porch was quiet. A mockingbird moved through its catalog somewhere in the oak tree. Calvin Whitmore looked at Evelyn Hartwell, and she could see it. Not guilt. He was too far past guilt for that, but recalculation. The rapid, visible recalculation of a man who had expected a particular version of this conversation and had not received it. I came here in good faith, he said. No, she said. You came here because you're frightened. And whatever you came to offer me, I want you to know that the answer is no, now and in any future conversation. She stepped back. I'd appreciate you leaving my property, Mr. Whitmore. He stared at her. She held the door. He put his hat on. He walked back to his horse, and he mounted without looking at her again, and he rode back down the road toward town, and Evelyn stood in her doorway and watched him go, and she understood with complete clarity that she had just shown her hand. He knew now that she wasn't wavering. He knew she had something. She went inside, and she wrote to Nathaniel immediately. He came here, to the property, directly. He made an offer. I turned him down. He knows something has changed, I could see it. I think we have less time than we thought. The response came back in an hour. I know. Roy saw him leave and came to me immediately. Ellison says we move now. Case is strong enough. He's filed for a hearing. Friday morning, judge's office in Fort Worth. Can you travel? She read it. Friday morning. Tomorrow. She wrote back, yes. Then she went to the tin, and she took out every document, and she packed the satchel, and she sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she thought about Thomas, who had bought this land with borrowed money and belief, who had told her she'd be more than all right, who had pressed a tin full of papers into her hands and said, "Don't lose these." She hadn't lost them. She was about to use them. They traveled to Fort Worth together. Evelyn and Nathaniel with Pete Daniels driving and Roy Briggs riding alongside. And the 4 hours on the road were unlike any 4 hours Evelyn had spent in the past 3 years, because for the first time she was moving towards something instead of holding ground against it. She and Nathaniel sat on the same side of the wagon for a long stretch of road that was too rough for conversation, and she was aware of him beside her, with the particular awareness of proximity that she'd been carefully not examining for weeks, and she thought, this is not the moment for that. There will be a moment. This is not it. She looked at the road ahead. He was quiet beside her. They understood each other. She and this man, in the specific way that people understand each other when they've been through something together that neither of them chose, and both of them met with the same quality of stubborn private determination. She thought that was enough for now. She thought it was more than she'd expected to have. The hearing was in a small room in the county courthouse with wood-paneled walls and a judge named Abernethy, who had the impatient precision of a man who had seen every variety of land fraud in 30 years on the bench and had no patience for the elaborate version. Calvin Whitmore was there, with a lawyer, a polished man from Dallas, who wore better shoes than everyone else in the room and had the confident ease of someone accustomed to winning on presentation alone. Harold Pruitt was there, smaller than Evelyn had expected, grayer. He sat apart from Whitmore, and he didn't look at him. And that distance 3 feet of charged air between two men who had operated in concert for 3 years told Evelyn everything about how solid Pruitt's cooperation was. Ellison presented the case in the organized, rapid sequence of a man who understood that judges valued precision over drama. The interest rate comparisons, the original loan documents against the renewal terms, the procedural failure in the acceleration notice, the timeline, the fence. And then Harold Pruitt, in the flat, careful voice of a man reading from the inside of his own conscience, confirmed the arrangement. Calvin had suggested the interest adjustments. Calvin had indicated which properties to prioritize for pressure. Calvin had said twice in Pruitt's hearing that the goal was to bring the Hartwell property to default without the widow being able to identify the mechanism. Without her being able to identify the mechanism. Judge Abernethy wrote something on his notepad. Calvin's Dallas lawyer objected 4 times. Abernethy overruled him 3 times and sustained once, which told Evelyn that the judge was listening, rather than decided which was the best possible version of a judge you could encounter. Then Abernethy looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I have your original documents here. I have the loan comparison. I have Mr. Pruitt's testimony." He set his pen down. "I'd like to hear from you directly, in your own words. What happened?" Evelyn looked at Judge Abernethy. She looked at Calvin Whitmore, who was looking at the table. She looked at Harold Pruitt, who was looking at his hands. She looked at Nathaniel Cross, standing against the wall behind her, and he gave her the very small nod of a man who had absolutely no doubt. She turned back to the judge. She told him. She told him about Thomas, about the loan, about the first renewal and the confusion over the numbers that she'd told herself she was too inexperienced to question. About the second renewal and the creeping certainty that something was wrong that she couldn't name. About 3 years of arithmetic at midnight. About the fence. About 6 cattle and a sheriff who called it deterioration. About 17 cents in her pocket in Callaway's store. About the acceleration notice with the missing cure period. About the sewing work and the notes and the documents in the tin and the reason Thomas had told her never to throw anything away. She told him all of it. Not with anger, not with performance, with the flat, precise authority of a woman who had lived every word of what she was saying and had kept the evidence. When she finished, the room was quiet. Judge Abernethy looked at his notepad for a long moment. Then he looked at Calvin Whitmore. Calvin Whitmore, for the first time in the 3 years that his machinery had been running against Evelyn Hartwell's life, did not look back. "Mr. Whitmore," Abernethy said with the specific quality of quiet that judges develop when they want to make sure a room understands that what follows is not a suggestion. I'm going to need your lawyer to explain to me why I shouldn't refer this matter to the district attorney's office this afternoon. The polished Dallas lawyer straightened his jacket. He began to speak, and Evelyn Hartwell sat in a courthouse chair in Fort Worth, Texas, with her hands in her lap and her spine straight, and Thomas's documents on the table in front of her, and she breathed in through the nose, holed out through the mouth, and she waited for the answer. The Dallas lawyer spoke for 11 minutes. Evelyn counted. She counted because counting gave her hands something to do, and because she had learned over the last several weeks that the discipline of counting, of staying inside a number, of not letting her mind run ahead to outcomes she couldn't yet control, was the only thing that kept the particular combination of fury and hope from becoming something unmanageable. The lawyer's argument was smooth, practiced. He used words like interpretation and standard variance and good faith business judgment, with the fluency of a man who had deployed them successfully before and expected to deploy them successfully again. He said that Harold Pruitt's testimony, while notable, represented the perspective of a man currently under legal pressure himself, and therefore not a disinterested witness. He said that the interest adjustments, while significant, fell within the range of discretionary decision-making that any bank officer exercised routinely. He said that Calvin Whitmore had expressed interest in purchasing the Hartwell property through entirely legal channels, and that expressing interest in a property was not however one might feel about the timing a crime. How was good? Evelyn could see that he was good. She could also see that Judge Abernethy was writing something on his notepad with the focused attention of a man cataloging what was being said rather than being persuaded by it, and she had decided that was the most important thing in the room. When the lawyer finished, Abernethy set his pen down. He looked at Ellison. "Counselor, the interest rate differential across the loans you've documented. Walk me through the calculation one more time." Ellison walked him through it. Abernethy looked at the numbers. He looked at Harold Pruitt. "Mr. Pruitt, the second interest adjustment, who specifically instructed you to implement it?" Pruitt's voice was low. "Calvin Whitmore told me the property needed to move faster. He said to make the carrying cost high enough that she'd come to the table within a year." The room was absolutely still. Calvin Whitmore's lawyer started to speak. Abernethy held up one hand without looking at him. The lawyer stopped. "Mr. Whitmore," Abernethy said. Calvin looked up for the first time in 20 minutes. He looked like a man who had spent considerable time in rooms like this one, and had always left them on his own terms, and who was beginning to understand that this particular room was not going to extend him that courtesy. "Is there anything you'd like to say directly?" Abernethy asked. "Before I make my determination." Calvin's jaw worked once. He looked at his lawyer. His lawyer gave him the very small, very controlled shake of the head that meant, "Do not speak." Calvin looked back at Abernethy. "I have nothing to add," he said. Abernethy wrote something. Then he said, "I'm voiding the acceleration notice in its entirety. Not on procedural grounds alone, on the grounds that the evidence before me indicates the notice was filed as part of a coordinated effort to induce a fraudulent default." He looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Hartwell, your loan terms revert to the original 1881 agreement. The interest adjustments of 1883 and 1884 are invalidated. Any overpayment resulting from those adjustments is to be calculated and returned to you by the bank within 30 days. He looked at Pruitt. "Mr. Pruitt, you will cooperate fully with the district attorney's office. I'm referring this matter this afternoon." He looked at Calvin Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, I'd strongly encourage you to retain counsel for the criminal proceedings." "Not this counsel." A brief, precise glance at the Dallas lawyer, someone with experience in fraud prosecution. Calvin Whitmore's face did something complicated and private, and then went still. The Dallas lawyer leaned toward him and said something very quietly. Calvin didn't respond. Abernethy gathered his papers. "We're adjourned." The room moved, and Evelyn sat in her chair for 3 full seconds after everyone else began to stand, because the particular quality of relief that moves through a body that has been braced for impact for 3 years does not arrive cleanly or quickly. It arrives in layers, like thawing. Like the way ground gives up its frost slowly, and from the outside in, and you don't always know it's happening until you try to move and discover that something that had been locked has come loose. She put both hands flat on the table. She breathed. Then she stood. Ellison was beside her immediately. He was shaking her hand and saying something about the district attorney's timeline and what came next with the bank, and she was tracking it. She was always tracking it, the practical information, the next step, the numbers. But she was also aware at the edge of her vision of Nathaniel Cross moving through the room toward her. He stopped when he reached her. I didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at him. Thomas's documents, she said, because it was the first thing that came fully formed, the thing she needed to say out loud to someone who would understand the full weight of it. They held, he said. They held, she said. Something moved through both of them at the same time, wordless and private and real. Then Pete Daniels appeared at Nathaniel's shoulder, with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who had been keeping himself professionally composed for 3 hours, and was now very close to the limit of that. We won, Pete said with the flat certainty of a man confirming something he'd been afraid to assume. We won, Evelyn said. Pete put his hat back on and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Roy Briggs from across the room caught Evelyn's eye and touched the brim of his hat. She nodded back. Outside the courthouse in the Fort Worth afternoon. Calvin Whitmore walked to his horse without speaking to anyone. His Dallas lawyer was at his side still talking. Calvin wasn't listening. Evelyn watched him through the window, not with satisfaction. Exactly, though satisfaction was part of it. With the particular clarity that comes when something you've been seeing from a distance finally resolves into its true shape, and you understand that it was always exactly what you thought it was, and that you were right to trust what you knew. She turned away from the window. She had a ranch to get back to. The drive home was 4 hours, and the light went gold, and then amber, and then the deep blue of a Texas evening that comes in fast in summer. And nobody spoke much for the first hour, because they were all inside their own version of what had just happened. It was Roy Briggs who broke it in the way that men who don't speak often do, when they finally choose to, briefly and exactly. Mrs. Hartwell, he said from the horse alongside the wagon. That fence, the one on the south line, I want you to know that I saw what was done to it before it was repaired. And I want you to know that I'm sorry I didn't say so sooner and louder. Evelyn looked at him. You were asked to look, she said. That was enough. Should have been sooner, Roy said. He didn't say anything else about it. She nodded. Yes, she said honestly. It should have been, but it was. They drove on. Later, when the blue had gone fully dark, and they were close enough to Red Hollow that she could see the distant yellow of town lights, Nathaniel said quietly, so that it was between them and not the wagon generally. What are you going to do first when you get home? She thought about it. Feed article, she said. He'll have opinions about how long I've been gone. Nathaniel made a sound that was almost a laugh, real enough that she felt it. And then, he said, she looked at the road ahead. At the dark land on either side of it, her land on this side, and the Cross Range on the other, the land that had been running alongside hers this whole time, without her having fully understood what that meant until recently. Sleep, she said. For the first time in 3 years without doing arithmetic first. He was quiet beside her. Then, Evelyn. She looked at him. I was looking at the road, not at her. The way a man looks at something neutral when what he's about to say requires all his available composure, and he's making sure he has enough before he starts. When this is settled, he said. The legal proceedings, the bank, all of it. He paused. I'd like to come to dinner, at the ranch, if you'd allow it. She was very still. Just dinner, he said. Not quickly, carefully. The specific care of a man who understood the difference between the statement and the pressure behind it, and was determined to make sure only the statement arrived. You don't have to decide now. She looked at the road. She thought about the notes in the tin. About how are you, and that means something, and the particular quality of being understood, without having to explain, which was rarer than most people acknowledged, and which she had not had enough of in 3 years. She thought about Thomas saying, "You're going to be more than all right, Evie." She thought he knew. He always knew more than she gave him credit for exactly what she was going to need. "Thursday," she said. Nathaniel turned to look at her. "I'll have the order finished by Wednesday evening," she said. "Thursday works." A pause. "Thursday," he said. Pete Daniels on the driver's bench kept his eyes on the road with the studied discipline of a man who had not heard a single word. They arrived back in Red Hollow close to 9 at night, and the town that met them was not quite the same town they'd left that morning. Word had traveled faster than a wagon. That was the thing about a courthouse hearing in Fort Worth. Lawyers talked to clerks, clerks talked to writers, writers talked to anyone who asked, and in a county where Calvin Whitmore had operated as a fixed point of economic gravity for 2 decades. The news that he'd been referred to the district attorney's office for fraud prosecution moved through Red Hollow with the particular velocity of information that rearranges things people thought were permanent. Marcus Webb was waiting at the edge of town. Not dramatically, he was just there leaning against the post outside his office with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who'd been tracking something for hours and was satisfied to see it arrive. He walked to the wagon when it stopped. "Judge Abernethy," he said. "Voided the notice," Evelyn said. "Referred to the DA. Loan reverts to original terms. Overpayment to be returned within 30 days. Webb looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd seen on his face in his office 2 weeks ago. Oh, the look of a man recalibrating what he'd thought he understood about the person in front of him. "I'm going to need a quote," he said. "No," she said pleasantly. He blinked. "Mrs. Hartwell. I'll give you a statement tomorrow, in writing, reviewed by my lawyer." She paused. "You've been fair, Mr. Webb. I intend to keep being fair in return. But tonight I have animals to feed." Webb almost smiled. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow," she said. She drove home. The next 3 weeks moved differently than any 3 weeks in recent memory, and the difference was a quality Evelyn recognized without being able to name immediately, and then named forward. Things were moving forward instead of holding still, and the sensation of forward motion after 3 years of bracing was so unfamiliar that she kept checking, kept looking for the thing she'd missed, the number she'd miscalculated, the door that had been left open somewhere. There was no missed thing. The district attorney's office in Fort Worth confirmed they were opening a formal investigation into Calvin Whitmore and Harold Pruitt within the week. Pruitt, operating under the advice of a new lawyer who understood that cooperation was now his best and only remaining asset, provided a full written account of every conversation, every instruction, every adjustment that Calvin had directed over the 3 years of the scheme. The account was 41 pages. Ellison sent Evelyn a copy, and she read every page at her kitchen table over 2 evenings. And when she finished, she set it down and sat with the knowledge that the full shape of what had been done to her was even larger than she'd understood. Not just the interest, not just the fence. Calvin had spoken to 3 potential buyers for the Hartwell property before the acceleration notice was even filed. Buyers. He'd already identified prices. He'd already negotiated contingent only on the property coming available in a distressed sale. He'd assumed the distress was a certainty. He'd assumed she would fail. She thought about that for a long time. Then she thought about the tin on the shelf. About 17 cents in a coin purse. About the sewing work she'd started 3 days after Thomas's funeral, because she'd looked at the numbers and said, "All right then. What can be done?" She thought he miscalculated the wrong woman. She closed the folder and she went back to work. The bank overpayment, $43.60. Once the full calculation was run, arrived by courier from Fort Worth in the 4th week, with a letter from the bank's new acting officer that was the most thoroughly uncomfortable piece of business correspondence she'd ever read, and that she read with a satisfaction she decided she was fully entitled to. She put $40 in the ranch account, and she took $3.60 to Callaway's. She bought the fabric she'd put back on the shelf 6 weeks ago, the good cotton, $2.30 worth. She paid with exact change. Old Mr. Callaway counted it without looking up, and then he did look up, and he looked at her, and he said with the particular discomfort of a man who had made a choice to look away from something and was now being required to look directly at it. "Mrs. Hartwell, I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "I should have said something," he said. "That morning, I should have said something to them." She considered him for a moment. Calloway was not a bad man. She had always known that. He was a man who had made the calculation that staying out of other people's trouble was the same as staying out of trouble himself, and he had been wrong about that, and he knew it now. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She picked up her fabric. "But you were honest about Thomas's sewing recommendation. That was something." He nodded. His jaw was tight. She left. She didn't tell him it was fine because it hadn't been fine, and she saw no reason to say otherwise. But she also didn't carry it further than that, because the weight of what she was already putting down was enough for one season, and she wasn't adding Calloway's courage problem to it. The suing orders had tripled. This was the thing nobody talked about openly. But everyone in Red Hollow was watching the way that a reputation once turned gathers momentum in the same direction the fall had taken it. The women who had asked Mrs. Brower for her name had told other women. The Delacroix Commission had been seen and admired. The news from Fort Worth had done what public vindication always does. In a small town, it had given people permission to openly value what they'd privately respected, and people who had quietly noticed the quality of her work for years now said so directly. She was booked 4 weeks out. She hired a girl from town, 17, nimble-fingered, the daughter of a family she'd known since Thomas was alive, to help with the cutting and the basic seaming. And she supervised and did the finish work herself, and the arrangement worked well enough that she started thinking about whether it could be made permanent. She was thinking about this on a Wednesday evening when she heard the sound she'd been peripherally aware of for a week. The particular way a certain horse moved up the road to her property, which she'd learned to distinguish from other horses, the way you learn to distinguish a voice in a crowded room, which was not something she examined too carefully, but also wasn't something she was going to pretend she hadn't noticed. She went to the door. Nathaniel Cross tied his horse at the gate, took off his hat, and walked into the yard. "Tomorrow is Thursday," he said. She looked at him. "I know what day Thursday is." I wanted to make sure the invitation still stood. She studied him. This man who had walked into Calloway's on a Tuesday morning and made a decision that changed the direction of everything, who had built a case. Brick by careful brick while she held the ground, who had sent notes every day and asked, "How are you?" and meant it the same way each time. "It stands," she said. 6 o'clock. Something in his face relaxed. Just slightly. The specific relaxation of a man who had been holding something carefully and has just been told he can set it down. 6 o'clock, he said. He turned to go back to his horse. "Nathaniel," she said. He stopped. "Bring Pete," she said. "And Roy. And Jimmy if he wants to come." She paused. They were part of this. They should be at the table. He turned back. He looked at her with an expression she had stopped trying to catalog because she had finally admitted to herself that cataloging it was a way of keeping it at a distance, and she was no longer sure she wanted to keep it at a distance. "I'll tell them," he said. He rode out. She went back inside, and she looked at the kitchen table, and she thought about what it was going to feel like to have people at that table. Real people. Not Thomas's absence, and her own arithmetic, and the lamplight that had kept her company through 3 years of careful, necessary, exhausting solitude. She thought it was going to feel like something she didn't have a word for yet. She started planning the meal. Thursday came. Evelyn was not a woman who made things elaborate. She was a woman who made things well, which was different, and there was a difference between the meal she'd have made 3 years ago and the one she made now, not in the quality of it that had always been there, but in the ease of it. The making of it without the background arithmetic. The setting of the table without calculating the cost of every candle. They arrived at 6, all 4 of them. Pete Daniels in his good coat, Roy Briggs in his one dress shirt with the collar slightly off-center, Jimmy Alcott with his hair visibly and painfully combed, and Nathaniel Cross with a bottle of wine from somewhere that probably wasn't Red Hollow. She let them in. They sat, and something happened at that table that Evelyn hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. Not drama, not the kind of moment that announces itself, but the quiet, accumulative thing that happens when the right people are in the same room at the right time, and everyone present understands without saying, so that this is one of the meals that will matter later. Pete told a story about the day he'd met Thomas Hartwell at a cattle auction in 1879, and Thomas had outbid him on a bull that Pete had driven 4 hours to bid on. He told it with the rueful appreciation of a man who could see the justice in it now, even if he'd been furious at the time. Evelyn laughed, real sudden surprised. "He never told me that story," she said. "He probably thought you'd take my side," Pete said. "I would have," she said. Roy Briggs said very little, as was his custom, but he ate 3 portions, and when he left, he shook her hand with both of his and said, "Good food, Mrs. Hartwell, good fight," which was from Roy the equivalent of a speech. Jimmy Alcott talked too much in the nervous way of a 19-year-old at a table with people he respected, and she let him talk because she remembered what it felt like to be young and trying to take up the right amount of space. And Nathaniel Cross sat across from her, and ate and listened and spoke when he had something to say and was quiet when he didn't. And she thought, this man is the same at my table as he is at his own. He is the same everywhere. She had not known many people like that. She had been one of them herself. She thought once before, 3 years of being judged had taught her to contract. She was expanding again. She could feel it, the particular sensation of becoming larger in the space you occupy, of taking up the room you'd been shrinking away from. After Pete and Roy and Jimmy had gone, Nathaniel stayed. Not long, not improperly, just the natural extra minutes that happen when a meal is done and the company is right, and neither person is quite ready for the ordinary sound of a horse going down a road. They sat at the kitchen table with the last of the wine and the lamp burning low, and Evelyn said, "I keep thinking about something." "Tell me," he said. "The morning at Calloway's." She turned the glass in her hands. "If you hadn't been in the doorway." "I was in the doorway," he said. "But if you hadn't been." I was quiet for a moment. "Then you'd have found another way," he said. "You were going to find a way regardless. You'd been finding a way for 3 years without anyone in that doorway." She looked at him. "I'd have been poorer for not knowing you," he said simply. "But you'd have been all right." She thought about Thomas. "You'll be more than all right." She thought they were both right about that. They just meant different things by it, and both meanings were true. "I'd have been poorer for it too," she said. He looked at her across the table. He said Evelyn. Just her name. The way he'd first used it in the courthouse, without announcement, without asking permission, like something that had already been true for a while, and he was finally saying it out loud. "I know," she said. He nodded. That was all. That was... He left at 9. She stood in the doorway and listened to his horse go down the road, and the sound faded into the dark. And the dark was the same dark it had been for 3 years, but it was not the same quality of dark. It had lost that particular weight of solitude that had become so familiar. She'd stopped feeling it, the way you stop feeling a pain that never fully goes away. She felt the absence of it now. She turned back inside. She looked at the table with the 4 chairs that had held 4 real people. She looked at the lamp. She looked at the tin on the shelf. Thomas's tin, hers now holding everything that had mattered. She thought, all right then. She thought, what comes next? It was the first time in 3 years she'd asked that question and felt something ahead of it instead of something behind. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. And for the first time since February of 1882, she didn't do the arithmetic first. She woke up the next morning knowing something had changed. Not in the world. The world was the same 40 acres, the same mule with the same opinions, the same sky coming up pink over the East Range. But something in the way she moved through the morning was different. She made coffee without calculating the cost of the beans. She fed article without counting how many days of feed were left in the bin. She stood at the window with her cup, and she looked at her land, all 40 acres of it, secured, documented, legally hers, in a way that had been threatened and tested and had held. And she felt something she hadn't felt in so long, she'd forgotten it had a name. Peace. Not the exhausted absence of crisis, which she'd been mistaking for peace for 3 years. Actual peace. The kind that sits in your chest without conditions attached. She gave herself 10 minutes of it. Then she picked up her work. Because peace, she had decided, was not the end of effort. It was the ground under effort. It was what happened when you stopped spending half your energy on fear and had the whole of yourself available for what you actually wanted to build. She had a lot she wanted to build. The girl she'd hired, Clara, 17, with quick hands and a serious approach to a seam that Evelyn recognized as the early signature of someone who was going to be very good, arrived at 8, and they worked through the morning on the cross order and 2 of the new commissions, and Evelyn found herself explaining things she'd previously just done. How to read a body for fit. How fabric moved differently on a person who worked outdoors versus someone who sat. How the finishing of a hem told you everything about the maker's relationship to their own standards. Clara listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that what she was receiving was not instruction, but transfer, the passing of accumulated knowledge from one set of hands to another. At noon, Clara said, "Mrs. Hartwell, well, can I ask you something?" "Ask." "When you started sewing for money, I mean, were you scared?" Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said. Clara seemed to expect more. Evelyn considered. "I was scared every day for about 2 years," she said. "And then one day I wasn't, and I tried to figure out what had changed, and what had changed was that I'd stopped waiting to feel ready and just kept doing the work until the work was the thing I was sure of." She paused. "The fear doesn't go away. You just get more sure of other things at the same time, and eventually the sure things outweigh the scared ones." Clara turned this over. "Is that what happened with Mr. Whitmore? You got sure enough?" Evelyn looked at her work. At the seam she was pressing flat with the particular care she brought to every finish. "Something like that," she said. The formal charges against Calvin Whitmore came down from the district attorney's office on a Tuesday 6 weeks after the Fort Worth hearing, and Marcus Webb had the story in print by Wednesday morning. Evelyn read it at her kitchen table, the way she'd read the first Courier story twice through, carefully tracking the facts against what she knew to be true. The charges were substantial. Fraud. Conspiracy to defraud. Improper influence of a financial institution. The DA had found, through Pruitt's cooperation and the documentary record, 3 additional cases of the same scheme applied to other properties over the previous decade. Smaller, quieter cases, where the target had sold before anyone looked too closely. Calvin Whitmore had not invented this particular method with the Hartwell Ranch. He had simply used it one time too many on one woman too many. Harold Pruitt had entered a formal cooperation agreement. He would testify. His banking license was already under review. Calvin Whitmore had hired a new lawyer. Not from Dallas this time, from Austin, which meant he understood the gravity of what he was facing and was spending accordingly. The story ran on the front page. Evelyn folded the paper and set it on the table, and she thought about the morning she'd walked into Callaway's with 17 cents and a list of fabric she couldn't afford, and the way 3 women had talked about her like she wasn't there, and the bolt she'd slammed back onto the shelf because her hands needed to do something with all that contained fury. She thought that morning was the beginning. Not of the trouble. The trouble had been building for 2 years before that morning. But of the end of it. The beginning of the end was that morning, because something in her had made a sound in that store that a man in the doorway had heard, and that man had made a decision, and the whole sequence of what followed came from those 2 things arriving in the same place at the same time. She thought Thomas would call that providence. She was more inclined to call it arithmetic. Same answer, different language. She got up. She had work to do. What she didn't expect was the knock at her door that afternoon. She opened it to find Margaret Aldis standing on her porch, not Dora Whitmore. Dora had left Red Hollow the week after the Fort Worth hearing, gone to stay with her sister in San Antonio, which the town interpreted correctly as the action of a woman separating herself from a situation that was no longer tenable. Not Cecily Pruitt. Cecily was managing a crisis of her own, given that her husband Harold was now a cooperating witness in a fraud investigation. But Margaret Aldis, who was Calvin's cousin by marriage, who had stood in Callaway's and said things about Evelyn's body and her grief and her dead husband that had landed like stones in still water. Margaret was standing on the porch with a dish in her hands, a pie by the shape of it. Her face had the particular expression of a woman who has rehearsed what she's going to say and is already not sure it's enough. Evelyn stood in the doorway and said nothing. "I made a pie," Margaret said. "I can see that," Evelyn said. A long pause. "I don't know how to do this," Margaret said, and for once the practiced social smoothness was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was just a woman who was uncomfortable and knew why and had come anyway. "I said things, in Calloway's, and after. I said things that were cruel. And I told myself at the time that it was just talk. Just how women. But it wasn't just talk, was it? It was part of something larger that I didn't understand, and I let myself be part of it without asking what I was part of." Evelyn looked at her. "No," she said. "It wasn't just talk." Margaret's jaw tightened. She'd expected or hoped for something easier. The automatic social absolution. The "it's fine, let's move on." She wasn't going to get it. "I know," Margaret said. "The things you said in that store," Evelyn said carefully, without anger. She'd burned through the anger over the last 6 weeks, and what was left was something cleaner and less comfortable for everyone, which was just the truth. Were things I had heard in various forms for 2 years before that morning. From this town. About my body, about my ability to manage my own affairs, about what a woman like me deserved to expect from her life. She paused. I had gotten very good at ignoring them. But ignoring something and being unharmed by it are not the same thing. You understand that? "Yes," Margaret said. Her voice was small. "Then I'll take the pie," Evelyn said. "And I'll tell you that I'm not interested in pretending that morning didn't happen. But I'm also not interested in carrying it forever." She took the dish. "What you do with the space between those two things is your business." Margaret looked at her. Something moved through the woman's face. Something that Evelyn had not expected, and that she thought on reflection was genuine. Not relief, but reckoning. The look of a person who had come expecting punishment or forgiveness, and had received instead something more demanding, which was the truth offered without verdict and the requirement to decide what to do with it yourself. "Thank you," Margaret said. She left. Evelyn set the pie on the table and stood there for a moment. She thought that was probably the most honest conversation Margaret Aldous had ever had on a porch, and she thought that she herself had been more honest in the last 6 weeks than in the 3 years before that combined, and she thought that honesty was exhausting and necessary, and she intended to keep doing it. She cut a piece of the pie. It was a good pie. She gave credit where it was due. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of a letter from Ellison's office in Fort Worth. She read it standing at the kitchen table with her coat still on from the morning feeding. She read it twice. She sat down. She read it a third time. The letter contained 2 things. The first was a notification that the fraud case against Calvin Whitmore had expanded significantly. Ellison's work, cross-referenced with the DA's investigation, had uncovered documentation of the same scheme applied to 2 other properties, and one of those property owners, a man named Garrett, a former small rancher who'd sold under pressure in 1881 and moved his family to Oklahoma, had been located and had agreed to testify. Calvin Whitmore was not going to walk out of this. That was significant. That was more than significant. But it was the second thing in the letter that made Evelyn sit down. In the course of reviewing the extended documentation of Calvin's financial activities, Ellison's office had found a property record that no one had thought to look for. The 40 acres that Thomas Hartwell had purchased in 1878 had a prior encumbrance, a lien filed in 1876 before Thomas bought it by a man named Horace Garrett, father of the same Garrett who was now agreeing to testify. The lien had been recorded. It had also been improperly cleared with a document that Ellison's review now suggested had been forged sometime in 1877 before the property changed hands. The forgery had not been Calvin Whitmore's work. It was Harold Pruitt's. Done before Calvin was involved. Done when Pruitt was a junior bank officer and Horace Garrett needed money, and Harold Pruitt had a way to make the problem disappear for a price paid quietly recorded nowhere. The Hartwell property. Thomas's 40 acres had a title history with a buried forgery in it that predated everything else by 7 years. Evelyn sat with this for a long time. She thought this is what they would have found if the case had gone the other direction. This is what Calvin would have used as a final mechanism if everything else had failed. Not the loan, not the fence. The title itself, the forged clearance brought to light at the right moment, making the property legally contestable in a way that could have taken years and lawyers and money she didn't have to resolve. He had known. He had always known it was there. It was the last card in the hand, saved for the moment when she'd spent everything else fighting everything else. She thought he had planned for 3 years to use this as the final move. She thought Pruitt in his cooperation agreement had either told them about this or they'd found it without him. She picked up her pen and wrote to Ellison immediately. The lien forgery. Does it affect my current title? The response came 2 days later. No. The forged clearance, despite its fraudulent origin, was legally operative at the time of Thomas Hartwell's purchase. Your title is sound. However, the forgery itself is additional evidence of Pruitt's long-term pattern of conduct, which strengthens the case. Your property is not at risk. She read those 4 words 3 times. Your property is not at risk. She put the letter in the tin. She went outside. She stood in the yard in the October morning with Article making his assessments from the paddock and the sky, that particular hard blue it got in fall, and she looked at her 40 acres and she thought, Thomas, you bought good land. She thought, I'm keeping it. She told Nathaniel that evening. He came to the gate at 5, not scheduled, just present the way he'd started to be present in the way of someone who belongs to a regular rhythm of a life, and has stopped requiring announcement to fit into it, and she was in the yard, and she looked at him and said, Ellison found a buried forgery in the original title. He went still. She told him all of it. He listened, the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without managing her through it, letting the information land in full before he responded. When she finished, he said, Calvin had it held in reserve. That's what I think. And it can't touch the current title. Ellison confirmed it. Howe was quiet for a moment. He thought of everything, Nathaniel said. Not with admiration, with the flat assessment of a man who had dealt with difficult opponents long enough to respect the architecture of their thinking, even while dismantling it. He didn't think of me keeping records, Evelyn said. Nathaniel looked at her. He built the entire scheme on the assumption that a grieving widow managing a failing ranch wouldn't keep meticulous documentation going back to 1878. She paused. That was his mistake, not the scheme, the assumption inside the scheme. Nathaniel Cross looked at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to catalog. It was, he said. Thomas told me, she said. He told me specifically, and I listened specifically, and I did exactly what he said. She looked at the tin visible through the kitchen window from where she stood. He knew. He knew I was going to need those documents. He just didn't know why. He knew you, Nathaniel said. She looked back at him. He did, she said. A pause. The kind that has weight. The kind where something that's been present for a while decides to stop waiting for permission. Nathaniel said, I'd like to be someone who knows you, not as a business arrangement, not as a neighbor. I'd like to be someone who knows you the way Thomas knew you, someone you don't explain yourself to, because you don't need to, because I already understand. He held her gaze with the steady particular quality of a man who has waited until he was completely sure before speaking, and is now completely sure. I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm asking you to know that I mean it. Whatever you need to think about, however long you need, I'll be at the gate. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about the first note, your work is the finest in Red Hollow, and I have no reason to doubt it. She thought about gray eyes that didn't flinch. She thought about being asked, how are you, and having it mean something. She thought about the courthouse in Fort Worth, and his nod from across the room, and the wagon ride home in the dark, and Thursday, and dinner with 4 people at her table, and Roy Briggs saying good fight with both his hands. She thought about Thomas, who had said, you're going to be more than all right, Evie. She thought he was right. He was exactly right. And this is what he meant. I don't need until tomorrow, she said. Nathaniel went very still. "I know what I think," she said. "I have known for a while. I've been being careful because careful is what I learned to be. But careful and honest are different things, and I am done choosing careful over honest." She looked at him directly, the way she looked at everything that mattered, without flinching, without softening with the full weight of what she meant behind it. "You're already someone who knows me. You have been for weeks. I'd like you to keep being that person." He stepped through the gate. He crossed the yard. He stopped in front of her. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes," she said before he'd asked anything else, because the question had been building for long enough, and she knew the shape of it, and the answer was the same regardless of how it was phrased. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically. The way you take the hand of someone who has been standing beside you through something, and you want them to know physically, unmistakably, that you are not going anywhere. She let him. They stood there in the yard in the October evening with Article observing from the paddock and the sky going dark over the East Range, and 40 acres of secured, documented, legally unassailable land all around them. And it was the simplest moment Evelyn Hartwell had experienced in 3 years, and the most complete. Calvin Whitmore was convicted in the spring. The trial lasted 9 days. Garrett's testimony held. Pruitt's documentation held. Ellison's case held. The Dallas lawyer tried 4 different approaches to the defense, and none of them survived contact with the physical evidence and the paper trail that a woman who never threw anything away had maintained in a tin on her kitchen shelf for 7 years. The judge sentenced Calvin to 4 years and ordered full restitution to all identified victims. Harold Pruitt received 18 months and permanent revocation of his banking credentials. Marcus Webb ran the story on the front page. Evelyn read it on a Saturday morning at a kitchen table that had been set for 2, because Nathaniel Cross had spent the night before at her ranch, in the proper sense that they had talked until midnight at that table about nothing in particular, and everything that mattered, and he had left at midnight because there were things still to be arranged, and she was a woman who made arrangements deliberately, and he was a man who understood and respected that. She read the story. She folded the paper. She set it on the table. She thought about the morning in Callaway's. She thought about the bolt of fabric slamming back onto the shelf. She thought about 17 cents. She thought about Margaret Aldis, and built to be a burden, and the alley wall, and counting to 60. She thought about all of it, and then she let it be what it was finished. Not forgotten. Not erased. Finished the way a seam is finished, turned, pressed, flat, closed. Something that holds. Clara arrived at 8 with the particular energy of a 17-year-old who had something to say and was deciding how to say it, and what she said was, "Mrs. Hartwell, I've been thinking about what you said, the fear and the sure things." "What about it?" Evelyn said. "I think I'm starting to be sure of the work," Clara said. "I did the barrow hem last night without asking you first. I wanted to see if I knew." "Did you?" "Yes." Clara said it simply without false modesty, which was exactly right. "Good," Evelyn said. "That's how it happens. One thing at a time." She put her apron on. She picked up her shears. She worked. In April, when the bluebonnets came up along the road between the Hartwell property and the Cross Range, which they did every year in the particular blue that the Texas spring produces, like an argument for something, Evelyn had never been sure what Nathaniel came to dinner on a Thursday and stayed until Friday, and when Friday morning came, he didn't leave. Not that Friday, and not the Fridays that followed. There was a ceremony in May. Small. Pete Daniels and Roy Briggs and Jimmy Alcott, who cried and was deeply embarrassed about it, and was given a talking to by Roy afterward that apparently helped. Clara and her mother. Mrs. Brower, who brought strudel and had opinions about where it should go on the table. Marcus Webb, who came as a guest and not a journalist, and honored that distinction completely, which Evelyn noted and respected. The Reverend asked her if she took this man. She looked at Nathaniel Cross, who was watching her with the steady, unperforming attention of someone who had already made every decision that mattered, and was simply here for the public confirmation of what was already true. "I do," she said, without hesitation, without arithmetic. In June, a woman came into the Cross Ranch's front office, which Evelyn had taken over a portion of for her business records, because the sewing operation had expanded beyond what the kitchen table could hold, and introduced herself as the wife of a rancher 3 counties east. She had heard she said about the case, about the fraud, about the woman who had kept the records. She had a situation of her own, she said, with a banker and a land deed and numbers that didn't match, and no one in her county who would take it seriously. Evelyn looked at this woman, 40-something, tired around the eyes, in a specific way that Evelyn recognized, because she had worn that same tiredness for 3 years, and she said, "Sit down, tell me what you have." The woman sat, she told her, and Evelyn Hartwell Cross listened with the complete detailed attention of someone who had been in exactly that position and understood exactly what it cost and exactly what it was worth to have someone in the room who believed you before you'd finished speaking. When the woman was done, Evelyn said, "Do you have documentation?" "Some," the woman said. "Not all. Start gathering everything. Every paper with your name on it going back to the beginning. I have a lawyer in Fort Worth." She pulled a piece of paper toward her. "I'm going to write you a letter of introduction." The woman looked at her. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." Evelyn picked up her pen. "Because someone did it for me," she said. "And the point of someone doing it for you is that it doesn't end with you." She wrote the letter. She folded it. She handed it across the desk. The woman took it with both hands, the way you take something that matters. The way Evelyn had once taken a bolt of fabric from a wagon she hadn't expected, and a letter that said, "Your work is the finest," and a tin full of documents that turned out to be the foundation of everything. "Thank you," the woman said. "Go home," Evelyn said. "Gather your papers. Write down every date and every conversation you remember, and don't throw anything away." The woman stood. "Don't throw anything away," she repeated. "Not a single page," Evelyn said. The woman left. Evelyn sat at the desk for a moment. She thought about Thomas, about the tin, about "Don't lose these, Evie," about the February ground that was too hard for the grave until 2 men with pickaxes broke it, about 3 years of arithmetic at midnight, about a bolt of fabric slamming back onto a shelf and a man in a doorway making a decision, and 17 cents that were the beginning and not the end. She thought about the bluebonnets on the road in April, about Clara's steady hands on a finished hem, about Roy Briggs saying "good fight" and meaning it, about Nathaniel's hand in hers in a yard in October, simple and unmistakable and permanent. She thought about what it meant to be a woman who had been told in 100 different languages that she was finished and had looked at all of that clearly and without illusion and said no. "I don't think so." She picked up her pen. She had 3 letters to write and 2 orders to review and a meeting with Ellison next week about the Eastern County case and supper to plan for Thursday when Pete and Roy were coming, and Clara had asked if she could bring her mother, and Nathaniel had said he'd be back by 4. She had all of that. She had the work and the land and the documented unassailable proof of a life rebuilt from the exact point where everything had tried to end it. She had more than enough. She started writing. And in Red Hollow, Texas, in the year 1886, the woman they had written off became the woman no one in 3 counties would ever again make the mistake of underestimating. Not because she had fought her way through the worst they could throw at her, but because she had done it with her records intact, her standards uncompromised, and her name on every page of the story they had tried to write without her. She had written it herself, every word of it, and it was hers.